coming up on the show. So when I think of stigma, I think, okay, yeah, it's bad. Just how bad is it that it requires this much attention?
Even when we think about stigma within our system, that you can't even reach out for help because of fear of harm.
Zoe got a call from her dealer saying, okay, I'm downstairs with some fentanyl. And Zoe looked at me and said, I gotta go now. What's the best thing for me to do right now? Okay, Zoe, let's go get the fentanyl. Come back up here. You're gonna smoke it in front of me.
On today's podcast, we speak to Agnes Chen, creator of Starlings Community. Not only does Agnes invite us into a discussion on the many layers of stigma, she raises awareness on a topic that we just don't hear much about, and that is the stigma experienced by parents struggling with problematic substance use is a child's rights issue. If you find today's episode activating, please reach out and talk to someone. If you would like to connect with Starlings or find out more information on peer support, workshops and trainings that they offer, you can find it at starlings.ca, starlings.ca. Your message is really direct. You've got this vision. The vision is a Canada that protects families from substance use, stigma, and its harm. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited for this conversation and really on that shared vision we have. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
When I think of stigma, I think, okay, yeah, it's bad. Just how bad is it that it requires this much attention?
You know, stigma is sort of a word we don't think of as discrimination, and they really are the same thing. Discrimination. It's just, I think stigma is a softer way of talking about, how we harm people who use substances. And so for me, Irving Goffman, he was in the 1970s. He came out with a book called The Management of a Spoiled Identity. It really highlighted how people treat you impacts your identity, impacts who you are as a person. For me, it was sort of this, why am I struggling with this? Like, people are saying we're reducing stigma, we're talking about stigma, we're defining, we're changing language about how we talk about substance use, but we still didn't have supports for people who use substances. We were still prescribing abstinence-based treatment. What happens when a person is afraid of a substance user, right? Like, you can't control that stress response, that fear response that happens inside of you. And so if you think you're in danger because somebody in front of you is using substances, it's going to be very hard to be empathetic and compassionate. And so we weren't looking at it from that lens, like, oh, I actually sometimes can't control my behaviors, or maybe I had a bad experience, or maybe I'm genuinely afraid because I don't know enough about substances.
I can't help but look at you and say, okay, wow, here's this person. You're doing something about this. You've created this Starlings website, great website, by the way. I love it that you have your mission statement right there. And me and Zoe had a great conversation about it yesterday.
Yes, we did.
So right on the homepage, it says, our mission is to increase access to resources and supports for youth impacted by the stigma of a parent's substance use. Can you kind of explain to me, how are the youth being impacted by a parent's drug use?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And so it's definitely a super complex, intersecting conversation and topic. We have to look at, well, what might that home environment be like? And then to understand really what might that community environment be like, which is where that stigma plays. And, for me and my family, with one of my parents, it was sort of, they were heavily criminalized, right? They struggled a lot. And, for them, it meant they ended up in prison. And I remember as a young child thinking like they were going to get help, like this system was going to help them. And then I really quickly realized, I was 5 or 6 the first time I remember experiencing stigma. I didn't have the words or the language for it, but here we were in our home having a crisis. And then we reach out for support, and then there's more harm. And then you actually saw that the system removed a lot of your supports, right? You were penalized.
Zoe, I want to drag you into this conversation a little bit because you've been through this.
Both my parents were addicts growing up. And it kind of went down the line to where I kind of brought my children into the mix, because once I had my children, then I developed my own addiction that I dealt with for about 6 years. And I'm finally just over a year sober, and my outlook on so much has changed, not only from what I went through as a kid with my parents and their addiction, but now with my own children and my addiction, how it impacted them and how my parents' addiction impacted me. So it kind of fell down the line. So I can resonate with so much of it. I mean, there's still questions that I have, like, in my active addiction, I was so scared to call any type of place such as CAS for help, for a hand, because I was so scared they were going to come and take my kids away from me. So how do you reach out to get help when you're in fear of a worse situation coming from it?
Absolutely. And there's like two things that just stand out like huge for me. And thank you for sharing like both sides of your experience. The one thing is, that's a common narrative for me. When I started doing this, I thought I was going crazy. Like, are we actually the only one seeing it from this lens? Or am I the only one seeing like the disconnect between what we're saying in both the literature and like the healthcare system and the experiences people are actually having? And that narrative, when I first started Starlings, and I basically put out a survey to Canada saying, hey, if you grew up with these experiences, tell me about it. And a lot of youth said like they themselves struggled with their substance use, but that the fear of reaching out for support was huge. That was sort of something that was very consistent in the themes that, when we collected I didn't want to reach out for help because then I would be removed from my home. And, in this work, when I chat with individuals, I often, it has happened on several occasions where I've been stopped within my presentation to say, but I am mandated to report. And so I have to. And so if somebody has that bias towards drugs are bad, it means a person's dangerous. If they find out a parent is using, then that spidey sense, that fear response, right, is like, well, you're in danger, I better call. And also, I mean, their license can be on the line. So there's that fear on that end. But that fear of being reported, like that, even when we think about stigma within our system, that you can't even reach out for help because of fear of harm. And that to me is the biggest, obvious example of stigma. And that was the thing when we asked, so 93% of individuals who responded to this survey, we had 211 responses, more than 50% were under the age of 24. And so we said, how did that home environment impact you? And so like 94% said it was super stressful. It impacted my mental health. It was 88 to 94% impacted, my sleep, my stress, my school, my friendships, impacted, every sense of that person's identity. And then when we said, well, how come you never reached out? Stigma, shame, there were no supports, or I didn't know what to find. And to me, it was like, well, 1 in 5 youth are experiencing this. We know it's double to triple the risk for mental health challenges, substance use challenges, and suicide. And yet we have a system where youth are afraid to reach out. And so similar to your experience of I was struggling as a parent, but I couldn't reach out because the reality is it's not even this like perceived harm. It's a very real harm of having your children be removed.
If somebody's in the position like we're speaking on, what do you think they should do? How can they feel safe in reaching out?
So a few things, and I always like talk about this, like this idea of who are your safe people in spaces, and it seems so fluffy and sort of like, well, that's not going to help me. And I know for me, it was like nobody's safe. But oftentimes society says, oh, I'm a healthcare provider, I'm a registered nurse, I'm safe, you should trust me. And it's like we try to like sell safety, like, hey, come get safety from me. And it just doesn't work that way. It's like, as an individual, identify who are those safe people. Like, so who are the people you can reach out to, whether that is somebody in your family, whether it's a friend, whether it is, anybody, even if they're not a counselor or whoever it is, like think about for yourself. And there's something really empowering about that to say like, oh yeah, I get to decide who I trust, not, someone telling me who I trust. And even like those spaces, it's like often we say like, go to the healthcare system, but we know that that's not safe for a lot of people. And so I would like, as a very initial step, I would say that is your first, like, figure out for yourself who is safe. And then like that next step, is who do I want to be able to reach out? Like, what is it that I need right now? And
Mhm.
can you reach out for that? If you're struggling, you want to be able to be honest, but you want to make sure that when you're sharing what the challenges are, that it's focused on like your health and well-being and how do you access that. So if you're like, I'm really stressed, my kids are stressful, what's that respite you can look for? So it's like almost doing a map of your own life. Like, who can I trust to talk about this? If I just need someone to offload, like my kids are stressful, I'm a parent, this sucks. Like, who is that person I can talk? And then it's like, if I'm struggling financially, or like, what are those things that are struggling, and try to like find like that next person that you can reach out to. And you know, and for us, the big thing is, you know, creating this new system where you can reach out and who is a part of that family's ecosystem, so that we eliminate, like we completely eradicate that fear of I'm going to be more harmed. And so, but those initial steps, I know that that's sort of, you know, they're not, you know, these huge, like call this person, they will,
Mhm.
it really is this of figuring out who you trust and like taking those baby steps to like be open with them.
I mean, I really resonate with this too, Zoe. When Zoe first came to me and she told me that she was an active user, I had no idea what to do. And within minutes, Zoe got a call from her dealer saying, okay, I'm downstairs with some fentanyl. And Zoe looked at me and said, I gotta go now. It was easy for me at that time to say, what's the best thing for me to do right now? Okay, Zoe, let's go get the fentanyl, come back up here. You're going to smoke it in front of me.
I will say, like Daniel, you know, that it gives me goosebumps on so many levels to hear like, and I don't know, Zoe, like how did, like, I'm curious to know, like, how was that for you? Because I know, you know, to have somebody to reach out to and then to have that response to be like, oh, you just care about my safety in this moment.
It was so different because the stigma that comes around, like along with using, it's basically don't enable the addict, don't give in to them, do not give them money, do not let them stay with you, they're gonna steal your shit. Like, you know, there's so much that comes along with it. And just to hear somebody like when my uncle was like, okay, so what do you need? What should I do? How can I help you right now? What is our next step? And how are we going to deal with this? It was just different. And it was like almost like a breath of fresh air. Like there's somebody that's not pushing me to the side because of what I'm going through. It's out of my hands. I can't change this overnight. And I had somebody that was willing to sit there with me for as long as it took to make sure that I was safe throughout this whole transition. So it was just, like I said, I don't know. We could have done some things that weren't the right way, but whatever we did worked for our family. And it worked really good because we are where we are right now. So it worked.
Totally. And you know, it's funny because, you know, for me, that idea of enabling, you know, I reached out to a counselor, and within 5 minutes of me sharing my story, which she said, you know, what was your childhood like? The first thing she said to me is, you know, you're being an enabler and re-traumatizing your family. And at that time, we were making sure one of my parents wasn't living on the streets. And so this idea, when people say enabler, they don't realize that you're enabling someone to live. Like society has this understanding that no, people have to fall flat on their face and they should be houseless, and you should remove everything that we know is actually
Everything, like,
opposite of
literally.
like supporting somebody's health and well-being. Like we have all this evidence that says like this is how you like protect someone's health and well-being, and yet we were doing the complete opposite just because as soon as substances were involved.
What, if anything, do we want healthcare workers to hear? What, if anything, would make a difference? Kind of going back to some of the other points you made about, you know, this duty to respond, right? And we've trained healthcare workers, whether it's social workers, counselors, you know, people in primary care, they've been trained to respond in a certain way. And sometimes I think we're led by a lot of fear that, you know, we have an obligation, fear that we have to respond a certain way. So, how do we begin to introduce a new way of looking at things that doesn't have to go down that path of reporting?
the way we approach like anti-stigma work, it's almost like these steps, and you see it in, over the last 2 years, I've been pulling apart different anti-stigma training, and it's always about this like awareness about stigma. So let's build this awareness about stigma. And I mean, there is just so much awareness about stigma now. And then it's sort of, assess your biases, and then it's listen to stories. And those are sort of the three that are continuously present. And, that fear that you spoke about, and, I, talks a little bit about it as well. That's the piece where people get stuck, because I can be the nicest person, but if I fear you, or just in general, if I'm stressed and I don't have the capacity, like the system isn't providing me with that space, I'm not going to be able to do any of those things, assess my own biases. And sometimes it's really hard, as a health professional. And, my co-ED, we're in the process of a merger, she's a social worker. It's really hard to criticize systems that are in a position to help. That's really uncomfortable. And as soon as we get uncomfortable, we're like, yeah, that's not us. Like, that's those people are causing the harm. I'm not a part of that. And like, I'm a registered nurse, who has worked in the system. I'm a big part of the problem. You know what I mean? And we all sort of have this. So for me, it's that bigger idea of, what is that training actually like? Are we really understanding how we respond to fear and substances? Do we have these preconceived notions of what a substance user is like? And there's a lot of data. 70% of people said, yes, I would have a safe consumption site in my neighborhood. But then when it came down to how many people like voted on it actually coming, it was like decreased by 30%. So it's like our perception, like the idea, that sense of like, yes, that's a beautiful idea. I think that's great. Let's get more support. But in reality, we're not voting for those policies. We're saying no to it in our neighborhoods. And in the States, there was a study on primary care physicians on prescribing opioid use disorder medication, like just simply prescribing medication that they knew would help people. And it was like a huge, people said, yes, people should have access to this treatment, but no, I don't want to prescribe it. And I wouldn't want them as a neighbor. Like the discrepancy in how we, believed we felt about individuals was like, yes, I think that they all deserve support. And it was like 70%. But then to have somebody in your family, to have a neighbor as it, or to even prescribe it, went down to like 20, 30%. And so in practice, we're not putting that empathy and compassion we have for people, that understanding we have of what, how do we address the root causes of substance use challenges? And so for me, that training, we do have that training, but do we, like even in Canada, Canadian Institute for Health Information in 2019, they did a survey. It was like 50% of primary care physicians interacted with people who use substances or had problematic substance use, but only 25, and I'm sorry, I don't have the exact data. It might be 25 or 15% felt well prepared to interact with somebody. And so do we have this training? Do we have a health system that is set up knowing the intersection between substance use, mental health challenges, and all those other areas of like poverty bias, racial discrimination, all those other intersecting factors? I would argue that we don't have that. And so I think the training we have is very sort of surface training of how can we build this awareness around substance users, but I don't think we dive into it deep enough. And then the other piece of it, how do we get people to not report and say, hey, yes, let's have all these other options? I think it's ultimately, we need to have guidelines within our, healthcare system that really doesn't enable us to jump to those conclusions that there's harm because substances are there. It's sort of like, for me and my personal experience with my dad, the first thing I always, have to roll my eyes is, he's there in withdrawals and he's not on any withdrawal medication. He's like, smokes like a pack a day, no nicotine patch. And they're like, well, why is he hallucinating? And why is, all these things. And it's sort of like, we're not even addressing, those things we all know of, right? And it's like, oh, the next day, the same thing. It's like, well, that hasn't been addressed. So how can we start to meet these needs to really understand, who is this person?
Let me ask you, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where addicts are so discarded and just thrown away? How did we get to a point where people actually have to ask themselves, is this person worthy of help?
Prohibition and like discrimination towards substance users is really embedded within like Canada's roots and, North American roots. And really, I would argue around the world. I mean, the prohibition of alcohol, in the Indian Act, that was one of the one of the things where unless you gave up your Indian status, you were not allowed to have alcohol. And so really, we can't disconnect like racism from the way we treat substance users today. In Vancouver, in the early 1900s, with the Opium Act, because of they related to anti-Asian immigration. There was a lot of Asian Chinese people immigrating to Canada. Opium was really big in China, and there was this narrative that, oh, there's a lot of Chinese immigrants and they're bringing all these, chaotic behaviors and, because of opium. And so there was the Opium Act came in, and it was related to anti-Chinese immigration. President Nixon, who like declared this war on drugs, and they tied even that to racism. And after all those different things over the last like 100 and some years, here we are with, 80 up to 80% of people in Canada's federal prisons are there related, have either used substances or are there because of substances. And there's overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and ethnocultural communities. And so I think this is a huge conversation. And so when we talk about, Lara, even when you said we have this training, we can't remove, we can't really have this conversation until we really dive into what are the roots of why we discriminate so heavily against substance users. What are those ingrained biases? When we look at the last 100 years of why we prohibited substance use, why that initiated, and how that has been embedded within, our healthcare system, our criminal justice system, and really every aspect of our society.
When we were going through this with Zoe, I mean, it was, first of all, it was such a life-consuming event. It just took everything from all of us to kind of get through it. And even me, I had a hard time talking about it. I didn't want people to know that my niece is going through a drug problem.
We know how that feels for you. Like, you're concealing something. And I think for me, it's recognizing, hearing my like grade 4 say, we Googled you at school. I showed my friend Starlings. And that fear I had of, oh my gosh, are parents going to not want like their kids because I'm talking about this? Like, I had that, like, that is a genuine fear. There's a reason why I'm really bad at promoting Starlings within my personal circles, because I say, oh, we're about youth mental health.
That resonates with me. I remember
Yes.
when my brother Dennis passed away from an opioid overdose. And here I am working as a mental health substance use clinician, overseeing a team. And I felt like, what does this say about me? Does this make me a fraud, a phony? Does this mean that I can't be good at my job? And if I was good at it, why couldn't I help him? So I feel you when you say that, because I think there's so many layers to this. And the training is not enough. The training that we receive is not enough to work at the levels that you're talking about. My work environment didn't seem like a safe place to say, my brother died.
When I talk about this to, nurses, it's, and that's the challenge. When I first started presenting on this, for me, it was, well, here's my professional face. I'm speaking to other professionals. There's no such thing. It is personal for me, and it's personal for a lot of people within that room who come up to me afterwards and say, that was my experience. That was my life. Like, and you start to realize, when we're doing this, the way we talk about it, in the lunchroom or on shift, that language we see, as a healthcare provider in the hospital, I saw how the health system treated people who use substances. Why would I reach out to that system? And, we hear this. It was the first year that we had youth presenting on a guide that we created in Vancouver for the Frame conference in February. And, it was really impactful for them. There's a gentleman who stood up and introduced himself as, a 55-year-old counselor who grew up with parental substance use, and he never got to talk about these experiences. He never acknowledged this, even with his own clients. And it's that recognition of, there's a reason we don't talk about it. Like, that stigma, when we think about it, why can't we, who are even like advocating, working on the front lines for this, there's a reason we can't even talk about it.
I can't help but think about the Just Say No campaign.
Yes.
And, Nancy Reagan, bless her heart, she had the best intentions. And a lot of people are saying, you know what, that the whole campaign didn't really work. And I'm sitting here saying, you know what, it did work, because half the people I run into still believe you can just say no.
You nailed it. Like, it was an effective campaign, and it catered to a system that wanted it to be that way. We want that message of just say no, and drugs are bad. And it brings this conversation, like, even talking with school systems here in Alberta, it's sort of like, as soon as you bring up substances, even that word addiction, even in hospital, for me, we would even remove like addiction services, because as soon as we say that word addiction, there's going to be stigma either on the person receiving that care or the
No,
person offering it. In our healthcare system, when my dad was hospitalized last year, I mean, they were working within addiction services, and it was sort of like, no, he can't get mental health supports until he stops using. And it's sort of that, like, what is it? I'm very confused, right? So this is embedded within the way that we do this. And so these words, substance use, addiction, when we think about a youth in a school setting, how we talk about this is going to impact them and validate whether or not they can reach out for help. And these themes are really prevalent, right? And so it's, for me, it's really finding a way of how do we just we have this on our website, stress, stigma, safety. How do we get people to understand, how does stress impact you? How has stigma? There's something to say about recognizing, like, oh my gosh, I can't reach out, it's not my problem, I'm not the problem, I'm not messed up, I actually can't reach out, it's not safe for me to find that help. And then that idea of, like, your school saying you're safe, but you've been harmed by, a teacher, or what I mean, who's, disregards you or treats you a certain way. Like, that person's not safe. It's okay for you to say that and recognize that. And there's power in that.
yeah, let me ask you one more question.
Yes.
Why, and this is going to sound really loaded and really weird, but I get asked this question all the time in my personal life. Why help the junkie? Why not just discard them and get them out of society?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. All those different areas. For me, when I first really started to do this work, so this was, again, and I'll go back to, when I moved to Calgary and I was really starting to struggle as a parent and whatnot. Dr. Gabor Mate's book, I'm sure you all have heard of it, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. In it, there was one statement in there, and he said, everybody can see the child, but they can't see the child, like, on the park bench that you walk past. And that really resonated with me, and that idea of, I challenge it, that society still doesn't see the child, even as a child, if substances are involved in that family. And so for me, it's having this deep awareness of, this is a human being. Was probably a better way of answering that, but for
No,
me, it really,
that was perfect. I mean, I love it. I mean,
Well,
it's kind of sad that it has to come down to, well, they're a human being, but I mean, I can't, I've even had people come up to me and say, you really should kick Zoe out of your house. It's not going to go anywhere. She's got to do this on her own. It's unbelievable the amount of bright, educated people that have said that to me.
There was a program that we had tried to get me into when I was still in active addiction. And they said, you need to be sober for this long before you can come in and receive help. And it's like, but I need help getting sober. So how, if I'm struggling getting sober and I'm reaching out for help, how do I do that before coming in? That
So,
should not be a stipulation to start a program.
yeah.
because if I have another peer support group and you come hang out and chat, but then you go into the system and, Zoe, how you said, like, you couldn't even get into a space. So how much effort, how much stress was that on you to go back and be like, hey, now I'm there, I'm where you want me to be, or to try to find another space? Like,
Oh, we lied about it.
exactly. You learn to, like, how do I know I'm not doing any of this stuff? But that it brings up so many different points, like, Zoe, how hard it is for people when they even are ready for that step and they say, hey, I am in this place. Like, we asked them to literally cut off all their limbs, to say, give up everything you've ever used to cope, go out into this, like, secluded area, and then now go back into the world, into all the stress you've ever had, and good luck. And it's sort of like, that idea of compartmentalizing it. That's why that system change work is so important, because we need to make sure that next time you go see your doctor, You're not afraid to say like, oh, hey, I started using again, or hey, I'm really, really stressed and I'm afraid of XYZ. Or if you go to, for people who access, when there's so many, that layered effect of every time you have to go and repeat what's going on with you and share that story and the expressions you might get or the questions you might get or the words they might use, how that might impact you. It's like, that's why we need that whole system change work for people to really start to talk differently. And more than that, for me, it's how we support people and address that need. And, back to the first story you shared, Daniel, like, and Zoe, is how do I say, what do you need right now? Like, how do we create a system that literally only asks that? Not even, there's this big push for, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. It's like, well, we have all that data. Like, let's stop doing research on this. We know all the information. Like, listen, stop spending the millions of dollars to repeat the same literature that tells us the exact same thing. If we increase access to support and resources, we decrease risk for adverse health outcomes. But we can't, as a society, determine what you need, because that's different for everybody. And so we have to be able, as a society, to start saying, hey, I see you're struggling. What do you need? I see you're struggling. What do you need?
Great.